Universal Basic Income Coalition has opposed the draft amendments of the Social Relief of Distress Grant regulations, which the organisation says contradict government's public commitments and might harm the most vulnerable. They say the Social Development Department has failed to take action on the inadequate value of the grant or to address the exclusionary provisions which have prevented millions from accessing the grant. Dr. Kelle Howson is the senior researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice and joins us more for this. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Perhaps let's just first start, Dr. Howson, with the understanding of what this basic or this income grant is about. Because there's so many others, and this emergency one we know was during the times of COVID, and there's been extensions after extensions. Tell us about your understanding of what you believe government was trying to achieve and what these changes then are about.
Sure. So as I think many watching will know, the Social Relief of Distress 350 grant was introduced during COVID-19 at the start of the lockdown period. The aim of it at that time was to cushion the blow, the economic blow of the pandemic, as a lot of people found themselves unable to work during lockdowns. And it did a good job at preventing or mitigating hunger during the COVID period and preventing people from falling into food poverty. But since then, as you say, it has been extended many times and it's been brought out of the disaster management framework into the social assistance framework. Effectively, because it's been in place for 5 years now, this is a permanent fixture of our social assistance framework, and it is helping to fill a gap that existed, which is income support to unemployed adults, of which we know there are many in South Africa. So government has repeatedly committed to using the Social Relief of Distress grant as a basis or a foundation for more comprehensive social assistance to unemployed adults. So they've committed to extend and improve the grant, and most recently we heard the President reiterate that commitment in his State of the Nation address just 2 weeks ago. So we see the Social Relief of Distress grant as being something more than what it was when it was introduced at the start of COVID. It has become a permanent fixture in the social assistance system.
And as you say, that over the past 5 years or so, the issue of inflation has really devalued the value of the grant itself. So if this is going to be improved, what would you then understand as the intention, as you say that it was meant to fill a gap? Well, the standard of living, the quality of livelihoods that South Africans contend with now, if we look at the issue of load shedding, which has destroyed many small, medium enterprises, and lots of jobs have been lost as a result of COVID-19. Just the state of affairs, the quality of life has dropped immeasurably. So what would improvement mean if we're talking about 350 against inflation and a very difficult set of livelihood circumstances?
Yes, we were very disappointed to see in this draft amendment to the regulations that the value of the grant has again stayed at 350 Rand. We think that there is just no justification for this, and it's completely contrary to the President's commitments, to stated government policy to improve the grant. One of the most important ways that the grant needs to be improved is that it needs to be adjusted to an adequate level that allows people to cover their basic needs, and that is set with consideration to the cost of living and to the national poverty lines, which are objective measures of the cost of living. So the food poverty line is now at 760 Rand per month, That's the minimum amount of income a person needs to meet their basic food intake requirements, so essentially to not be starving. When the SRD grant was introduced in COVID, the food poverty line was less than 600 Rand. So we've had very high inflation over the past couple of years, and it's important to mention that food and transport have been subject to higher inflation than the overall rate of inflation in the economy. So food inflation reached about 14% last year, and that impacts the poorest households disproportionately because they spend a greater proportion of their income on food. We know that 93.3% of social relief of distress grant recipients spend their money on food. So essentially, the fact that the grant has not been adjusted for inflation and that it is less than half the food poverty line is the same thing as the government rolling back the grant. And that's a retrogression of the government's constitutional obligation. The Constitution requires the government to progressively realise the right to social assistance. Essentially, that means building on what is already there. So the grant has lost a lot of its value, and not increasing it in this draft amendment is literally going to plunge more people into hunger, precarity, and food poverty.
You also note that because of certain regulations, particularly placed by Treasury, the grant itself is exclusionary, and the improvement that government is also looking to effect, it says, is that it cancels payment to any grant recipient who has not been paid out in 90 days.
Yes, so there are a lot of, aside from the grant value, there are a lot of other injustices and administrative issues that have gone along with the management of this grant. And all of these issues flow from the fact that the budget for the grant is inadequate. Treasury has given an inadequate and arbitrary budget allocation for the grant, which essentially means that not everybody who needs it is able to receive it. There just isn't enough money allocated. Government isn't funding its own policy. So because of this arbitrarily low budget, the Department of Social Development has needed to find ways to prevent too many people from getting access to the grant. In other words, people who need that grant, who should qualify, have been prevented from doing so. And that is that's happened through a range of different drivers. One is the fact that you can only apply for the grant online, so this excludes people who don't have access to the internet. Another is that the means test, the income eligibility threshold, is 624 Rand per month. So if you have more than that, you are not eligible for the grant, and that's below the food poverty line. So there's a subset of people who are living in food poverty who are seen as not being eligible for the grant. There are other processes that inaccurately prevent people from getting the grant, including the way that government verifies people's income through checks on their bank accounts. So all of these together have meant that DSD has underspent on the budget, which in turn gives Treasury a justification to continue cutting the budget so that fewer and fewer people are getting access to the grant. And another of the administrative issues that has plagued the grant, as you point out, is the fact that many people who are approved to receive the grant don't end up getting paid. So based on the latest data we have, about 13% of people who are approved for the grant don't end up receiving their payment. And that happens for a whole range of reasons that stem from the mismanagement of the grant. And with this amendment where DSD is essentially saying, if you haven't been paid after 90 days, we're going to cancel your grant, we're going to cancel your application. They're shifting the blame onto beneficiaries for their own ineffective processes.